myths of native speaker norms. That's a question for TEFLologists. Is it better to focus on form or to focus on forms? That's a question for TEFLologists. If you use a textbook, is your classroom authentic, or should your approach be more learner-centric? Feedback to learner autonomy. We'll discuss it all on TEFLology.
Welcome back to the TEFLology Podcast, a podcast all about teaching English as a foreign language and related matters. The COVID-19 crisis has plunged the language teaching industry into a more precarious situation than ever. With in-person classes largely not being able to take place, international and domestic travel and mobility disrupted, some private schools have unfortunately not been able to attract or retain students or provide a language education service. For teachers and other members of staff, this has sadly meant redundancies, dismissals, curtailments of working hours and pay, changes in contract, and a great deal of upheaval all round. The uncertain situation has meant at times that institutions may not have treated their workers fairly and respectfully, and in some cases may have acted illegally. As a result, unions have found themselves continuing to play a pivotal and important role in supporting and standing up for the rights of those working in the language teaching industry. One such organisation is the TEFL Workers Union. The TEFL Workers Union is a union for foreign language teachers in the UK, organised by the Industrial Workers of the World, IWW. The union was formed in 2019 and represents cleaners, teachers, admin staff, and interns. The union has fought for paid meetings, paid continuing professional development activities, paid sick days, and an end to 0-hour contracts, for example. Having learnt about the group's work on Twitter, we decided to reach out to the representatives to see if anyone would like to share their stories. So, in this episode, we're pleased to be featuring the stories of 6 individuals related to the union who are based across the UK and Ireland. In a similar way to how we made an episode earlier this year on teachers' emergency remote teaching responses in different parts of the world, we shared a series of questions with a group of participants who each recorded their answers and returned them to us separately. What you're hearing here today is an edited collection of these responses. So to start things off, here are the group introducing themselves and their professional context and talking about their union-based activities.
Hi, my name is Jade. I'm based in London. I'm an EFL teacher. I've worked with the union as a staff representative during the COVID-19 crisis.
Okay, I'm Simon Francis, based at EC English London, member of the TEFL Workers Union and elected rep at EC for the recent redundancy procedure.
Right, so my name is Ray Goodspeed. I was a TEFL teacher for a very long time. I started TEFL teaching in 2004 to 2006 when I went to teach in Moscow for International House. From 2006 until 2019, I've been a language teacher in London, but I retired last September 2019. Since then, I've been active as a sort of an IWW rep at large, just representing any workers that need representing, and by virtue of being retired, I was able to do that more easily. And so I've been representing workers in different schools other than the ones I worked in, and have been involved in employment appeals tribunals and that kind of thing.
Hi there, my name is Hannah. I'm originally from Newcastle, but I'm based currently in Glasgow and have been this is my 5th year now. I graduated from the Glasgow School of Art in June with a first class in fine art, painting and printmaking, and due to COVID-19, I could not pursue my original ideas post-graduation, so became an online EFL teacher. I became involved with the union a few months after that, I think July, August time, due to a sudden change in contract with the company I was working for and all of its workers, without any kind of conversation happening around that or any kind of agreement. This new contract put our hourly pay under minimum wage, and the contract basically reads much more like a employment contract than a self-employment contract, and we were definitely treated as such. So because of all this, myself and a group of other workers for the company got in touch with the union, and since then we've been helping in organising a tribunal against this company. So most of the work so far has been paperwork stuff. I've helped by drawing a few illustrations, which the union have been using across social media in the tribunal campaign.
Hi, my name is John Whipple. I'm involved in 4 organisations. One is, the main one is Unite the Union. They have an English language teachers branch, which I was very happy to help set up a few years ago. That came out of the ELT Advocacy Ireland group, which campaigned for greater power for teachers and a better voice for teachers in the English language teaching industry in Ireland. I'm part of the TEFL Workers Union, which is an international group, which is part of the IWW and focuses mostly on the UK, but we've got a few members here in Ireland as well. Finally, part of the Teachers as Workers group, which is a special interest group which was rejected by TEFL but continues to organise regardless. You can see us at teachersasworkers.org.
Hi, I've been a TEFL teacher for about 20 years. I started teaching at an English conversation school in Japan back in the late 1990s. I've taught in a couple of other Asian countries and Australia, but I've been based in the UK for nearly the last 15 years. I was recently made redundant from one of the largest English language schools in the world. I joined the IWW and the TEFL Workers Union a couple of years ago. This was a result of my frustration with the treatment of teachers, not just in my language school but in the industry in general, and I set about persuading my fellow workers to join the union. I had mixed success. There was a lack of awareness of what the union could do, particularly amongst the younger members of staff. There was actually a lot of the teachers were unsure if they could even join a union because of a 0-hour contract, and there was a lot of fear that they would get into trouble with management if management found out that they were a member of a union. They weren't scared that they would be sacked, but they were scared that their hours would be cut, which was essentially equate to the same thing, because if you're not getting the hours, then you can't live. That job is no longer viable. This attitude towards the union did change somewhat for quite a few staff members as the COVID pandemic progressed, when I managed to persuade more members of staff to join the union. I acted as one of the staff reps for the redundancy consultation process, and the IWW and the TEFL Workers Union supported us throughout this process, and I think as some of the teachers saw the support the union were giving us, I think they realised that it would benefit them to join the union. So definitely more staff became union members during the pandemic.
Next, we're going to hear our contributors talk about some of the most common issues that union members have raised or been made aware of as a result of the COVID-19 crisis.
One of the most common issues that union members have raised has been to do with the unfairness of some of the contracts within the TEFL industry, particularly where we're based in London, some schools have kind of their pick of the lot, really, and have the kind of contracts that make it very difficult for temporary staff to have any rights at all in the event of being dismissed. And that has adversely affected a lot of people this year.
There are not that many members in EC, but there are followers and supporters. And it was concerns about safety measures provided for any return to work that led to some discussion, and me personally contacting the union. Now, this was rapidly eclipsed by the redundancy procedure, and issues being discussed now are really the follow-on from that, particularly concern over those made redundant not being put back onto furlough, although the UK government has made provision for that with the extension of the furlough scheme.
The most common issues, really, as a result of the COVID-19 crisis, have been the fact that the rights that TEFL teachers had already, or the rights that TEFL staff in general had before COVID, were really laid bare once COVID actually began to have an effect. Because if, for example, like in one school, we had a situation where people were on fake self-employment contracts with no sick pay, no holiday pay, no pension of any kind. Clearly, when the COVID crisis closed the school in early March, there was no furlough, there was no redundancy, there was no benefits of any kind, and in that particular case, one of the schools went off and took the last 6 weeks of salary with them as well. So that was pretty devastating for the workers concerned. That's been subject to an employment appeals tribunal, which we've won, but we still need to actually get hold of the money, and it's possible the school now could just declare bankruptcy and so on. Equally, if you had a situation where the teachers in another school were employed on temporary contracts, which never lasted longer than 2 years, which meant essentially that they would never become members of staff with full employment rights. So when redundancy was then announced because of the cutbacks due to COVID, workers who'd worked there for 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 years got no official redundancy. They just got a kind of a gesture of goodwill payment of 3 weeks' salary. But they were entitled to much more than that in terms of their year's service. But because their most recent contract has only started a year ago or so, certainly not more than 2 years, then they got no official redundancy money at all, and that kind of stuff. So it's really the fact that the TEFL sector had such terrible rights for its employees anyway, and in COVID situation, these have been really exposed, and workers have really suffered by not having those rights. Everything from the inability to get furloughed, fake self-employment, wages deduction, all of those issues.
I think because of the COVID-19 crisis, obviously, people can't work in the usual way. They can't go to offices or buildings, wherever it is. They normally work in groups outside of home. So a lot more people are certainly turning, or don't have a choice but to turn towards home office situations. Obviously, EFL teaching is a really good example of that. But because of the massive influx of people wanting to take part in this, I think it's sort of allowed companies to take advantage somewhat. People are really desperate for work at the moment. You know, people being made unemployed. Furlough doesn't really cover the whole pay packet. In the case of myself, recent graduate, I suddenly left university prematurely. You had to leave in March instead of June. So I had the total end of my education up in arms, up in the air, with no real direction of where to go next, aside from my university subject, art, which isn't really, theatres are closed, TV was paused, people aren't really investing their money in paintings at the moment because everyone's pretty strapped for cash. And aside from that, my training really would be in bartending, waitressing, etc., all of which are obviously closed for the pandemic, so my employment options were very much limited. And I was delighted to get the opportunity to do some teaching online. But the desperation of the situation and the speed at which I felt I had to pick up work at the time means that it's very easy to take advantage of workers such as myself. I've had plenty of jobs in the past, but I'm still fairly young. Most jobs have been sort of cash in hand situations, part-time, local jobs. So I never really had to read through contracts in depth. Wouldn't really know what I was looking for in terms of my rights. So I think that certainly made it easy for these online companies to really take advantage of people's desperation and vulnerability at the moment.
The most common issues that union members have raised or have been made aware of in our area as a result of the COVID-19 crisis has been the survival of the industry. So the number one issue is the survival of the industry. Teachers were excluded from the discussion around regulation and governance in the industry, and that's abominable. The question first took shape as a question of kind of when would we return to the classroom. This was around safety. But numbers now across the industry are between 10 and 20% of what they were this time last year. So without government payments, it would have been impossible to sustain the industry or even imagine it continuing to next year in the same size. So the government put together a payment called the Pandemic Unemployment Payment, and that's for anybody who's lost their job permanently. But there are other payments that the government's made, and without those, the industry would simply have collapsed, and it would be very difficult to restart until student numbers and demand really went back up again. So most teachers are thinking, they've never faced precarity without losing their jobs. It's just part of ELT. All precarity is outsourced onto teachers. All losses are outsourced onto teachers. Teachers always lose their jobs whenever there's any kind of stress. So it's kind of a very strange situation to see that we're keeping our jobs regardless of the school's precarious position. Usually we just get chucked out. So inside our school, inside our union, one of the major issues was the fact that the government had set up a working group and they'd excluded teachers. This is, of course, ridiculous because they had said that they were including all the stakeholders. What they did was they included government bodies and they included ownership bodies, but they left out all students and all teachers. So how you can include the stakeholders in education without teachers and students was a little bit ludicrous. They reconstituted that body after the first shutdown, and they've now included the teachers' unions. There's two teachers' unions that are included here: SIP2, which is the largest general union in Ireland, and Unite the Union, which is the English language teachers' union of choice because they represent teachers outside of the public sector. So outside of public sector areas, you might have some schools that are set up inside universities. They'd be represented by SIP2. Private chain schools like the ones that I've always worked in, or even private individual schools like boutique schools, tiny schools that are just set up by a couple of teachers. The teachers inside those schools would be represented more frequently by Unite. Unite was willing to take more of a risk on these guys, and they organized quite a bit better, and we worked with them to organize. So those unions are now included in this working group. And that means that we can ask those questions. The questions that we wanted to ask, we actually, being a democratic organization as a union is, we took surveys of our hundreds of members, and we came back with answers. And most of those were concerns around safety and quality, and of course precarity and bullying, and what's going to happen afterwards, because our industry was a very precarious industry. It featured in a couple of think tanks. Questions and investigations into precarity in Irish life and how that affects people's mental, physical, social well-being. English language teaching is a huge and apparent example of precarity in Irish life. So that's something that's not going to change. So that's one of the big concerns: is will our schools survive? And if our schools survive, Will we have enough hours to stay with it? Will we get enough hours to live with it? We know that there's no commitment from owners to teachers. That's obvious. They've actually organised against us and to exclude us from the working group previously. And so, yeah, the main issues of that, chief areas of concern are, safety from the disease, safety from homelessness, safety from joblessness.
Some of the common issues between union and non-union members raised as a result of the COVID were, well, initially there were concerns about things like PPE. There was a lack of PPE in the UK generally, so people were worried would be able to get the PPE. There were concerns about the school not being closed down soon enough. Lockdown came late in the UK compared to the other European countries, so teachers felt very concerned that they were still going into classrooms and teaching full classes when there was a deadly virus out there. There were also concerns about entitlement to adequate sick pay. Most of the teachers are on 0-hour contracts, so they're only entitled to statutory sick pay. So if they had to self-isolate or they unfortunately caught COVID, they would only be entitled to about £90 a week. And they actually wouldn't get anything for the first 3 or 4 days. Then classes went online, and then there was concern about the quality of the classes that they were delivering. We were expected to use the same materials that we used in face-to-face classes as we did online, which was obviously inadequate. There was also no additional preparation time given to teachers. The school was increasing the number of students in the online classes than they had in the face-to-face classes, which made all this a lot more challenging for the teachers. The other concerns were students not really participating in the online classes, which teachers found very challenging. And then as face-to-face classes recommenced, there were concerns about some students not self-isolating when they should have been. There were concerns that teachers were asked to self-isolate because they were identified as an immediate contact with someone that was either suspected of having COVID or did have COVID, but then later being asked to come into the school to cover classes. And the teacher felt, I have to do this because there's a redundancy process going on, and if I'm not seen as a team player, then maybe I'm going to be one of the people that lose my job.
So we're now going to hear from our participants of some examples of positive and negative ways in which language schools have responded to the COVID-19 crisis.
I would say some of the positive ways that language schools have responded to the COVID-19 crisis is, of course, to try to make their environment as safe as possible for staff and for students. But I think most commendable is how quickly a lot of them tried to move into online teaching so that their staff and their students would be safe from risk. I would say the negatives is that, unfortunately, for a lot of schools, they had to kind of let their staff go. But I think that a lot of it was, in some sense, a knee-jerk reaction to a situation. I don't blame them. Everybody was in the same situation where nobody knew what to do. The government was equally in shock. But I would say that the language schools, I think, could have responded with just a little bit more of a humane approach. I felt that in some cases, teachers were painfully reminded of how disposable they are. And I think it's just how you do or deal with such situations that makes a difference.
Well, at my place, there's still quite a buoyant atmosphere. Communications between staff and local management are pretty good. I'd say the best example I've actually seen myself in the industry after over 25 years of being in it. There was some discontent over initial communication at the start of the first lockdown, but it's been generally a good response to initiatives like online socials and quizzes. And unlike the stories I've heard from other schools, there was a genuine listening and some shift in approach from senior management during the redundancy process. And quite a high number of staff have managed to remain on payroll. Also, local London management have also been open to creative suggestions on handling some of the unforeseen, unfair consequences and complications that have come from this process and this situation with the lockdown and the changing rules and so on. On a more negative side, arguments concerning the reluctance to put staff back on furlough have partly, well, to quite an extent, been financial. Now, this coupled with a defensive response concerning the assets and capital of the business owners, to me, it certainly demonstrates an instinctive profit over welfare attitude that senior management feel kind of pressured into representing, and that's a negativity to be totally expected. And I think it illustrates the fact that workplace organisation is crucial to the maximising of the positives that we have seen. I think it's good at the moment the staff have been able to exercise some control over whether they return to the physical classroom or not. But this has been on a totally individual level, and to some extent that's fair enough. But I would also like to see a more collective approach encompassing a situation where a union, or at the very least a staff association presence, is taken as natural and just kind of part of the furniture, and reps are regularly consulted and involved.
Some schools were okay. I mean, some schools, the school I used to work in some respects was okay, in the sense that as soon as the lockdown happened in March, they put all their staff on furlough. They took part in the furlough scheme. The workers were all employed legally, and they weren't on fake self-employment. They weren't temporary workers. They were fine. They got their full 80% of their salary under the furlough scheme, based on their set hours, which is fine. I mean, they could survive, really. Although later on, that didn't work out so well, because they then went, as soon as the furlough scheme was altered such that they had to contribute to it, the employers had to contribute to it from the 31st of July, that was the date the same company chose to go into liquidation. And so all of the staff lost their jobs. Having said that, a week later, the same school opened a new school under the same different company name, and on that basis just carried on trading, even though they'd made their staff redundant under a liquidation scheme, and they just got statutory redundancy pay. But they did get statutory redundancy pay, and they did get furlough beforehand, so that was better than most, although they were still pretty badly treated. Other than that, I can just mention the fact that people have been treated very badly in the ways I've already said. Some schools just closed and went off with the last few weeks' salary. They dodged their redundancy payments by pretending their staff were on temporary contracts, or only on a very short contract, when in fact they'd worked there for very many years. So there was all sorts of dodgy dealing. At the worst case, though, was when literally even the hours that they'd actually worked in the 6 weeks before the beginning of March, that to this day has yet to be paid, running in some cases into thousands of pounds.
Positive examples of where schools have responded to COVID have been in the provision of sick pay, where previously they had taken a cheap, owner-centric approach to pay. Some schools have reviewed that and they've put their staff and their students at the centre, and some have begun saying things like, we don't have all the answers, which is very refreshing to hear. Some have said, we are not going to open until there's a vaccine, because we know that our tiny building doesn't allow us to distance properly. Negative examples abound. You can imagine an owner who permitted coercive management techniques to raise profits for himself while endangering some of the lowest paid, most precarious, most dedicated education workers in the country. That same owner was acting like that before COVID. Now they feel they've got their back up against the wall, so every resource is being put into exploiting the teachers. And horrifically, and I think much more visibly, the students. We've seen students bullied into losing their visas. We've seen students being told lies about how the law works to get them to write letters to the government to say, please don't regulate our industry, because it means that I won't be able to stay here. There are just so many stories In fact, so many stories that an all-Ireland student union was formed. It's called ELSU, English Language Students Union. It may not be appropriate for every jurisdiction, but in our jurisdiction, the majority of our students come from abroad. So we'll have mostly students from Brazil, Korea, Turkey, countries that are outside the EU, while we're inside the EU. We might have some students, short-term students, who'd come from the EU, but most of the students require visas. So to stay here, they have to maintain those visas. They might stay on 2 or 3 visas. They also have the ability, and this is not true in the UK at the moment, they have the ability to work part-time. So they come over with a certain amount of money, and they know that they'll expend that very quickly on a deposit and getting set up with the school. And then they need to kind of earn as they learn. And this means that they're very precarious, and they're very dependent on information to the school and the management there, and the management's very desperate. So they're using the students, and they're telling the students, look, you have to renew with us. If you don't, you won't be able to get a visa. Stories like this are everywhere. So the English Language Students Union was formed, and they've been accepted by the government as a legitimate voice of the student community in private English language schools, and thank God they have. Now for teachers, we see things like just an all-out assault on their working conditions, in that they're not being allowed to work at the school, of course, but they're also being forced to use their own computers in most cases, and if their computer breaks down, they're being denied hours and being denied pay. And unlike, say, any office worker here in Ireland, if they don't provide their own computer, they're locked out of work in a lot of these cases. We also see that the numbers of students are dropping tremendously because a great percentage of the students would have been from the EU, and they're simply not traveling, and they don't want to pay the high prices for essentially online education that they could be getting from teachers in, very famously the Philippines for, a tenth of what they're paying these English language teachers in Ireland. And it's just, it doesn't make any sense. They actually want the experience of traveling to Dublin and hanging out here and drinking Guinness in pubs. And they're not going to get that online, no matter how prepared we are for our lessons. But teachers have seen huge threats and really nasty stuff, like schools saying either a very famous case for me was a teacher who rang me and said, the school is forcing me to teach full-time, and if I don't teach full-time, they're going to withdraw my contract. So they're just going to say, we're not going to give you any more hours, which essentially means I'll be out of contract. They also said that they wouldn't allow me to get the government benefits because I had refused work. But the fact of the matter is he has responsibilities outside of school, and he signed a part-time contract at a lower rate of pay than he had worked in a previous school because of the flexibility and because of the part-time contract. Now they were forcing him to go full-time, and they were saying that if he didn't, that they were going to make sure that he was going to get zero money for the next 4 or 5 weeks until his payment could be processed from the government. This would have meant risking homelessness. And this was the kind of threat that the management was simply bandying about, like they were saying, I'm unhappy, I'm going to make you homeless. It's atrocious behavior, and yet it's accepted because the school owners are quite desperate, and they're lashing out. And they're lashing out against, of course, the most vulnerable. There's an atmosphere of fear and coercion, and the we're all in this together talk kind of makes me queasy.
So I think, unfortunately, in our school, our experience of how the school responded to the COVID crisis was mostly a negative experience. The school very, very, very quickly instigated a redundancy process. This was despite staff requests to delay this, particularly when the furlough scheme, which was set in place by the government to support employers to specifically reduce potential redundancies. This meant that, as well as dealing with the pandemic, having classes go online, we also had to deal with the threat of redundancy right from the very beginning of the pandemic. There was also a refusal to extend the furlough scheme when it seemed like the school would have to contribute a little bit more towards it. The government did change this as it became apparent that the pandemic was going to last for much longer, but most of the staff that were going to be made redundant had already been made redundant, and the school did not take these staff back on, even though they technically could have, and put them back on furlough. So their lack of support and care for their staff meant that staff missed out on the government furlough scheme, which they could still be receiving now if the school had not been so quick to instigate the redundancy process. And for me, that is the biggest failure of the school. I do appreciate that the UK government were not very proactive in this sense, and that some of the announcements regarding the furlough scheme came very late in the day. But I feel that our organisation were very quick to make people redundant. During the redundancy process, there was also a refusal to deal with staff on a nationwide basis. They wanted to deal with each school individually. This is despite the fact that we're saying, we can't discuss this because this will affect all schools. So they wanted their cake and they wanted to eat it. There was also a refusal to discuss anything beyond the statutory redundancy payment. I felt this was particularly harsh, considering that our school would take on a lot of newly trained TEFL teachers, and obviously a lot of them quite young. It also meant that they hadn't worked at the school for more than 2 years, and if you don't work at the school for more than 2 years, then you are not entitled to redundancy pay at all, leaving them in a situation where they're going to have no financial cushion at a time when there's a global pandemic. The TEFL industry has been hit really, really hard, and their chances of finding a job elsewhere is practically zero. There was also a feeling that the redundancy process was used to get rid of troublesome staff that might be more inclined to speak out if they're unhappy with any policies that management were implementing, things like that. And also perhaps that they already knew which staff they would like to retain and which staff they would like to get rid of, and that the staff that they would like to get rid of would be those ones that weren't available at a drop of a hat to teach. So any staff members that had responsibilities outside of the workplace, basically.
Next, we're going to hear about whether there are any ways in which the aftermath of the COVID-19 crisis could bring about progressive changes to language teaching workers' rights and conditions.
I think to some degree the COVID-19 crisis has made a lot of workers, particularly in TEFL, start realizing that people put up with pretty bad conditions and very uncertain conditions for a long time because they like their jobs. It's something that's a vocation. And in cases like this, when a crisis arises, suddenly people find that they don't have that much in terms of rights and protection. I think it's going to make people more aware and to push for fairer contracts, for example, to push for companies to actually do more to retain their staff in the same way that larger organizations do, who may not necessarily be based in TEFL.
Well, generally, the link between macro issues such as government policy and even things like climate change, the link between those and the day-to-day pressures that language schools face, it's much more obvious now. It forces politicization. It makes clear, I think, to more people the enduring class struggle reality of contemporary society and economics. For example, the redundancy process. Now, that was a major spur to staff communicating about and exploring their interests as a whole. And in such a situation, I think arguments about organisation are far easier to make.
After the COVID crisis, I'm not sure what will happen in the TEFL sector, the TEFL industry, to be honest. One supposes that a lot of the online systems, which have now been properly trialled by necessity, would carry on. That people there'll be a greater incidence of people learning English from their own countries. If there's a proper vaccine and the COVID-19 virus is beaten, so to speak, then maybe you will see a not as extensive, but to some degree a return to people actually coming to cities like London to learn English, because there's the overall kind of thrill of living in an English city for 6 months or 3 months or a few weeks, and that's always going to be popular with some types of students. I've read articles suggesting that that there'll be much more of an emphasis on learning English in schools as children than as adults. But I really don't know how far that's going to go. The trouble is, I think, because of the contraction in the industry, there are still, for the foreseeable future, going to be more trained TEFL teachers and the associated admin staff than there will be jobs for them. So I think that if we're not careful, there will be a reduction in terms and conditions and wage levels to meet the fact that the demand exceeds the supply. And so I think there'll be a pressure on lower wages and worse conditions. People will be inclined to accept worse wages than they would otherwise have done, because they'll be desperate for jobs. I think that's why building the union consciousness, I mean, during this crisis, so many more TEFL workers have had their first dealings with the union to defend themselves. And I think that will be an interesting situation. I think having experience working with the union, hopefully that principle will carry on, and there will be more unity in the TEFL industry, and people will get together to demand better conditions, which will cut against the overall tendency to reduce wages and to reduce working conditions and increased hours and so on, larger classes and so on and so forth. So there's a double-edged thing. Workers have seen what can happen if they're not unionised. It's been brought into sharp relief by the COVID crisis, and maybe they'll learn some lessons from that. We can only hope.
Yeah, I think it could definitely be the case that in the aftermath of COVID-19, some positive change can come about to language teachers, because people can't work in offices and other buildings at the moment right now. More people are definitely turning towards online work, language teaching being quite a main option there. And I think that the vulnerability and desperation at the moment is certainly allowing for them to take advantage of people. But I'm hoping that the sheer amount of people who are getting involved in this work and the amount of people who are unfortunately being taken advantage of will mean that it will really shed light to how easy it is to really manipulate people.
There could be more inclusion for teachers' voices, more power for teachers. Teachers need more power in their staff rooms and in their schools, and in the regulation, the establishment of regulation of the private English language teaching industry. They need more power. They need it for physical safety and for their mental health and for the good of their students, but they also need more power for the longevity and viability of the profession. If ELT is a real benefit to the world, if everyone speaking English is a real benefit to the world, then it can't depend on the profit motive. And there are questions around whether it is a benefit to people. Language is wrapped up in and wrapped around culture. It's often centered on promoting a white culture and a US-UK hegemony. And we need to have the power as teachers to revolutionize ELT, to make it worth preserving as an inclusive and communal social act and profession. So if it's worth preserving, we need to be able to make sure that it's safe from the for-profit model, because this is not a safe model. And every teacher in Dublin can tell you right now, they're scared that their school's going to close down or be affected in such a way that they, as an individual, are going to lose their jobs, and the majority of their students won't be returning in a face-to-face format. These schools are just going to disappear. Most are scared. Now, some people have faith, but a lot of people are scared. And if you think that English language teaching is a good, and that everybody speaking a common language is a good, then it can't just depend on the profit motive. Schools are, again, centers of work, both learning and teaching and cleaning and planning and communicating. The owners are profiting from all this working. Every time somebody goes to work and there's a boss there, that boss is there to make sure that they get a bit of that extra that comes off of their work. That's the profit. And when you have that profit motive, the person who is profiting, the owner, that person is going to try to drive those profits up because they're competing with the other owners. This is why people set up schools and they don't keep teaching. They want to be that owner. Now, some people recognize that system and realize that they're being that it's too precarious for them, so they move into management. But in a lot of cases, what we have is schools whose owners are worth millions, at least in Ireland, and all around Europe. I mean, EF, very famously, the owner is worth $6 billion. The Holt family, which is $6 billion, they actually loaned the Crown Prince their yacht so that he could go have his honeymoon on it. And that place needed a union very badly. And the first school strike that I ever noticed was at an EF school here in Dublin. It was so very justified to go on strike there. If you've never been on strike in an ELT school, make it a goal, especially if you don't get paid for prep or if you have precarious and a simultaneously low-paid contract. You should, if you're willing to work on a low-paid contract, have a permanent contract. It shouldn't be precarious and low-paid. There's no way it should be like that. You should certainly go on strike about that. And if you don't know how to go on strike, that's because your school's not organized and you need to organize. But if you have no sick pay after COVID, for example, go on strike with your fellow teachers. Going on strike is how we regulate in an unregulated profession. That's what you do. It's actually not safe to work in your school if there's a staff member with a sore throat who's going to engage in work presenteeism because she can't afford a day off, or he won't do it because he doesn't think it's a big threat to everybody else. You should strike. Strike for safety. Strike for sick pay. If your managers don't make an offer of sick pay after you tell them that you're talking about your need for sick pay to feel safe as you return to face-to-face teaching, then you need to call up two of your most trusted colleagues and tell them it's time to talk. And I think that a lot more people are going to take themselves a lot more seriously in the profession, or they're going to take exiting the profession a lot more seriously. But dithering between the two, I think that's got to have to come to an end.
In terms of progressive change in the industry as a result of COVID, well, I think that there's an increased awareness of how unions can help workers. And this can only be a good thing. More teachers are now members of unions. Just recently, EF Language School had to backdate some pay to staff members because they received unpaid training, and they also had to back pay holiday pay, which was underpaid to all staff who were furloughed.
Okay, so finally, to end this episode, we're now going to hear some guidance that the panel provided with regards to union activities or employment-related subjects in light of the pandemic.
I would say to any teachers, managers, or school administrators listening to this episode, with regard to union activities, I think as much as sometimes schools might not necessarily want to encourage their staff to be part of unions for, their own reasons, I do think it's a good idea to just make sure that your staff are represented by somebody who is a neutral party other than yourselves. I think for teachers, it's a good idea to get involved with the union, get to understand your rights some more, and work together to, I think, create a fairer environment for teachers and management alike to work together. I think in the light of all the ways that the pandemic has affected people, it would be a good idea to find a kind of more harmonious way of working together in the future that takes care of the staff who are, in effect, the prized possessions of the school to some degree, a little bit more than students because they provide the service. So hopefully this is going to start putting the rights and the interests of staff at the forefront of schools in the same way that they value their customers.
Guidance for managers would be recognise finally, will you, that staff are your main resource, that you're really only as good as your staff. And if your staff are badly treated, if your staff are very low morale, then your school will not be as good. You can always tell a good school, and the students can do it as well. The students can tell a good school by the rate of turnover of staff. If staff have been there very many years, I used to advise students when they were saying, which school should I go to? I said the first question to ask would be, what's the turnover? How long have most of the staff been working there? If it's been very many years, then you can work out that it's generally a good school because the staff have stayed. If there's a constant turnover, then you know that the staff morale is low, and the level of expertise, the level of experience of staff will be lower, and the product you're paying for won't be as good. So managers need to recognise that their staff is their main resource, and that they shouldn't always just go for the cheapest option. They can sell the product of high quality teaching. For teachers, I would say my advice would be to know your rights. You've seen the COVID crisis has demonstrated what schools will get away with if staff are not unionised and if rights are denied. So once the COVID crisis is finished, I think teachers need to insist on decent rights to begin with. So should any other crisis happen in the future, that then they will already have the rights to protect them with regard to redundancy and payments and holiday pay and all of that stuff that so many have been denied in this crisis. I think only if all of the TEFL workers stay together can we change industry. There'll be a tendency towards divide and rule. There'll be a tendency towards, offering work to those who are desperate for work and will accept anything, and not employing people who cause the slightest bit of trouble. But I think the only way to counteract that is if workers in the TEFL industry stick together and refuse to accept certain types of conditions in certain kinds of schools. You can hope that some of the very worst schools have gone to the wall, and that maybe only the more respectable schools, shall we say, have survived. I'm not entirely sure that's what will happen, but you can hope.
I'd really advise anybody who is an online language teacher to get involved with the union. I didn't really know much about unions at all before the company that I worked with changed its contract, and we got involved with the IWW to help us. They've supported us all when we're feeling really anxious and upset and angry, and rather than just throwing these feelings into the void, they've helped to direct it in a really productive way. We're taking the company that I'm working with to tribunal. Hopefully there'll be some sort of monetary settlement out of that. They're also trying to support us financially over Christmas, which I didn't expect at all, but is a really amazing gesture. And yeah, it sort of helps bring some stability back, I think. Between the unfair treatment at work and the pandemic, it's quite easy to feel out of control of things right now. But with the union, I sort of feel like I'm gaining back some control. It isn't a totally hopeless situation. And it's just great to know that there's people out there who are willing to stick up for your rights. And the union workers that we're dealing with are mostly voluntary, I think. So it just also feels like a nice thing to be part of.
Okay, school administrators are part of this industry, which is constantly taking pieces of pay from teachers. The EF example is important because owners think that they will be EF one day, that they're going to find some way to get everybody to work for almost nothing and be fired easily. And if you're a school administrator, if you're working in the administration, you're part of that process, and you will be one of those people who gets cut out. So I would suggest finding a more reliable industry, something that's got longer vision. And just because you're an English language school owner, it doesn't make you a bad person. But if you're operating in a private industry, this means you're subject to the pressures of the market, profit and loss and competition. Even with the best of intentions, this means our interests as workers for paid sick days, paid prep, or guaranteed hour contracts affect your bottom line as an owner. And this is why we as teachers need to stick together as workers, because even with the best of intentions on both sides, we have different material interest than the bosses. And that's just a fact. The kind of things we want won't change until we establish them as a standard across the industry. That's one of the reasons in Ireland that we've aimed at regulating the industry, and we have a regulatory aim in the industry, not a school-by-school industry, but across the industry. Everybody's got to change. And that can only be done through regulation or a simultaneous gigantic strike. And we think that strikes, of course, are dangerous and destructive, and their memory lasts forever on the internet. So we need regulations, and when they become a standard, not a perk that's offered at a generous school, then we'll have a decent industry to work in again. So for teachers, I'd say talk about your issues to other teachers. Write about it for newspapers in your area, local newspapers, national newspapers, whatever. Write about it online. Again, teachersasworkers.org, or a union's blog in another country. If you don't feel safe writing in your own country, you can write about your industry or your experience in your school for UPE Malta, or for Ireland's Unite ELT, or for the TEFL Workers Union in the UK. Help teachers in your previous school to organize. Make connections on social media if you have to, but in person wherever possible. Be known inside your union. So you have to join your union. It makes perfect sense to join your union. And most good teachers, most what we call in Ireland real teachers, the ones in primary school and secondary school that have benefits and pension payments and all that kind of stuff, they're in a union. Any teachers that you went to, you met teachers in school and university, they were in unions. It's not a bad thing to be in a union. I mean, every famous actor is in a union. It's not weird to be in a union. It's normal, and it's correct. If your boss makes you feel like it's something threatening, he's the problem. She's the problem. Make proposals for action inside your union. Follow through on the actions, and don't quit. Stay in teaching. Keep teaching. If you like teaching, keep teaching. You can make it a good job, and we can make it a good job together, but don't quit. Look at the union efforts that have been successful in other schools and other jurisdictions. Organize to get sick pay permanently now. Now's the time to organize for that, and you keep it forever. Learn how to strike. Learn all the other actions that you can do before striking too. Learn how to take those actions. Talk to the people who work inside your union. They're very knowledgeable about the law and about how industrial action works. Learn about that. It's not something you're taught in schools. You need to learn about that in the real world here, and the union's a great place to learn. Get permanent defined hours contracts as standard. This is a time that things should change in English language teaching. So I would say, managers, allow your teachers a real elected representative in the COVID-19 return procedures with face-to-face teaching. That role of being an elected representative from the teachers inside your school to make sure that managing that change back to face-to-face classes, to make sure that happens in a safe way, that should be a respected role, and it should be paid training. There should be paid time to do the role. You should recommend that the boss furnishes each teacher with a computer for teaching class if they need to return to remote teaching. Make sure a contribution is being made for the use of the teachers' homes, if at all possible. As a workplace. Finally, communicate regularly. Ask teachers to present an elected teacher to raise the concerns weekly through their union. Tell them that you respect the efforts that they're making through their union to improve their school and their sector and their society. Remember that unions are a great force for equality and justice, and you should do whatever you can to join a union yourself. Now, managers aren't allowed to join, for example, the TEFL Workers Union, because it's not open to managers. But you could join another big general union, which is perhaps not as active. But I would suggest managers have a huge part to play in this. But one of the big ones is considering which side they are on. And I would strongly encourage teachers who are working in management roles right now to go back to teaching and to start organizing their fellow teachers with the knowledge that they have and bring about real change in English language teaching so that this is a safe, dignified profession going forward in the future that's paid well and does good things in the world.
Thank you for listening to today's episode. We'd like to thank our contributors again for all of their insights about today's topic. If you'd like to learn more about the union, then we'll put a link in the description. And if you'd like to get in touch with us, you can send an email to TEFLology@gmail.com. You can follow us on Twitter @TEFLology. You can like our Facebook page. And if you are so inclined, please leave a review or a star rating on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts. See you next time.